Someone was asking when will the recording be posted. It should be available by sometime next week. So it usually takes us a week to get it edited and available on YouTube. So Johanna and Dean Stamos, shall we begin?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So, thank you. Yeah.
Great. So good evening. I'm delighted to see you all and grateful that you have joined us. I want to say first that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Humanities website in the near future. Today is our 6th distinguished lecture. Prior speakers include Keith Wailu, Rafael Campo, Teresa Brown, Rita Sharon, and Karen Nakamura. Last fall, when the Center's Executive Committee discussed whom to select for the 2019-2020 academic year, we realized that we had a person of such distinction in our very midst. We were excited to have UCI's very own Johanna Shapiro deliver the distinguished lecture in the spring of 2020. But then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and general quarantine put everything on hold. That said, we did not want to lose the opportunity to learn from our dear colleague, so we are grateful to Dr. Shapiro that she agreed to deliver her talk in this online format. We have some special guests this evening to offer by way of introduction some remarks about just what kind of scholar, colleague, and amazing person Dr. Shapiro is. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Stamos, Dean of the School of Medicine here at UCI, to share his thoughts. Thank you, Dean Stamos.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this evening. Sorry we can't be together, but we are together, aren't we? So that's really important. So I'm glad that this moved forward despite the change in venue. Welcome everybody to this year's Distinguished Lecture in Medical Humanities. I would like to first thank Professor Lee, but also the faculty and staff of the program for the dedication that they show each and every day here at UCI. More specifically, I want to, of course, honor Dr. Johanna Shapiro, this year's guest lecturer, for her contributions to UCI over the past 4 decades. Dr. Shapiro serves as the director of our School of Medicine, Medical Humanities and Arts program, and is also a professor in family medicine at the UCI School of Medicine. She has been honored with lots of great awards over the years, but I'll just give a couple of highlights to make sure we have plenty of time available for her words and then a discussion perhaps afterwards. She's been honored with the Gold Star Award from the Gold Humanism Honor Society, as well as the Leonard Tao Humanism Medicine Award by the Arnold P. Gold Foundation, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Among her many accolades and excellence in teaching awards, what really distinguishes Johanna Shapiro is her emphasis on whole person care. And as healthcare leaders, we must be able to be relating to our patients when they have pain and suffering, whether it's physical or emotional, or as she would say it, having the ability to walk a mile in our patients' shoes is the key to delivering compassionate and effective healthcare. She has written and lectured extensively about the art of doctoring and empathy in today's medical education. These are skills which are so important, which she not only teaches, but possesses as well. I could not think of a better person to headline this year's event. On behalf of the School of Medicine, I want to offer our sincere gratitude to Dr. Shapiro for the work she does to further medical education, not only here at UCI, but really across the state and across the nation and beyond. Thank you very much, Dr. Shapiro. And I see Professor Haynes has now joined us, so welcome, Doug. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Michael. I just first want to acknowledge Jim Lee as the director of the Center for Medical Humanities and acknowledge your work, Dean Stamos, as being a continuing supporter of the Center for Medical Humanities. along with Stephen Barker, the Dean of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts, and of course, the Dean of the School of Humanities, Tyrus Miller. This is actually a pretty significant moment for me because about 5 years or so ago, we all met in a nondescript room in the School of Humanities, brainstorming. And Dr. Shapiro was there, of course, Jim Lee was there, and many others. And what was so striking about that meeting was the generosity of colleagues coming together around a shared idea that we can actually work together to explore the meaning of health, healing, and well-being. And what was so striking about it was three unlikely schools: the School of the Arts, the School of the Humanities, and School of Medicine. And throughout that, I want to acknowledge Dr. Shapiro's leadership in really setting an example, modeling interdisciplinarity, and more than that, creating the conditions for more of our colleagues to be comfortable in engaging in interdisciplinary practice, particularly in fields that they're particularly passionate about, but they may not be experts in, but they bring powerful insight. It's been 5 years since that meeting. And in the meantime, we were able to get funding to create the Medical Humanities Initiative and generate a tremendous amount of momentum that includes public-facing programming that really reached people throughout Irvine and Orange County, undergraduate, minor, as well as a graduate emphasis, and a considerable amount of public-facing and campus-facing programming. And so I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted to be here to honor our distinguished speaker, Dr. Johanna Shapiro.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Haynes. Thank you, Dean Stamos. I just want to introduce as a postlude that Professor Doug Haynes is the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCI. I want to say that Vice Chancellor Haynes has been instrumental in the development of medical humanities at UCI. It was he who secured the 3-year grant to build the Interschool Medical Humanities Initiative that began in 2015 to forge this relationship between the schools of arts, humanities, and medicine. And then he served as a founding director of the Center for Medical Humanities, and it is in his shadow that I have the honor to serve as the current director. So Vice Chancellor Haynes, Dean Stamos, thank you both for being here. I also want to thank Rachel Perlman, Samantha Anderson-McCull, Teresa Waters, and Michelle Strombeck from the School of Medicine, and Tudi Yi from the Office of Inclusive Excellence for their support toward this event. And I remain always indebted to Amanda Swain, Executive Director of the Humanities Center, and the Center for Medical Humanities staff, Joanne Jamora and Sam Carter, for making this event possible and a success. Thank you to the Center's Executive Committee and Advisory Committee for their wise guidance. Finally, in addition to Dean Stamos, I express gratitude to Dean Stephen Barker of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts and Dean Tyrus Miller of the School of Humanities for their continued support of the Center's activities and mission. Thank you all. I will introduce, believe it or not, Dr. Shapiro in just a moment. But first, I want to let her and the rest of us in on a secret that we've been keeping from her ever since we started planning for this event last December. A friend of the School of Medicine, and specifically of Dr. Shapiro, Dr. Jonathan LaPook, Chief Medical Correspondent for CBS News and Professor of Medicine at NYU, wanted to send some remarks on this occasion, which he graciously agreed to do via pre-recorded video. So let's welcome Dr. LaPook.
How wonderful.
Hi, Johanna. Surprise. Congratulations on your retirement, although I know you'll still be involved in humanities-related research and teaching. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. John LaPook. I'm the Chief Medical Correspondent for CBS News and a Professor of Medicine at NYU Langone Health. I first met Johanna by phone 6 years ago because of the Empathy Project, which uses Hollywood-quality short films and other materials to try to teach clinicians in training to be more empathetic, sensitive, and competent. Well, we did a huge literature search about empathy, and of course, all roads led to Johanna Shapiro. So we reached out to her out of the blue. Do you remember, Johanna, 6 years ago? It was in August of 2014, which I know because I found the email with our notes. 90 minutes you spent with us, with Debbie Rubin and me. Debbie has been, of course, my partner in crime on this and collaborator from the very beginning before the project grew to much larger. And you gave us such wonderful pieces of advice. I mean, very specific pieces of advice that I've always felt, looking back at then, you know, you have a rocket ship and if it launches 1 inch to the right of where it should be, it ends up 1,000,000 miles off course. Well, you moved it to the left. You said, you know what, launch it this way. And I remember one specific piece of advice you gave us that's so valuable and so sophisticated is keep it messy. You know, the understanding that medicine is improv, it is messy. And you have to have mid-course corrections and you have to be able to adjust. Well, over the years, those mid-course corrections became a theme. As you helped us with scripts, you were so honest, especially if we had a script that really wasn't so good. Remember that one? And you said, you know what? This isn't so good. And we kind of knew that too. But that honest feedback has been so important. And then fortunately, a couple of years ago, we got to meet you in person. Debbie and I flew out when I was giving the commencement address to the UC Irvine School of Medicine. And we had the pleasure, the privilege of watching you give a master class to medical students. And of all things, you used about a 60-second clip that we had produced of a fourth-year medical student who had to give some bad news about severe heart failure to a young man in his 20s. And she found as she was talking to him that he was getting down and she was feeling down. And in the middle, she stopped and she said, wait a second, I have to be a source of light for him. And she made the mid-course correction and she changed her tune and things ended up much better. And you took that 60 seconds and you turned it into something which I will never forget, really. Not only were you beautifully listening to the students and they listening to you, but you had this back and forth that led to an evolution of their way of thinking. And you were able to say to them, look, you see what she did? You see that she was able to realize that she was heading in the wrong direction, but that's not the end of the world. She took herself out of it. She said, wait a second, I gotta make a mid-course correction, that theme. And you can do that. And think of the pressure that takes off, you explain to the students. You don't have to be right, you just have to be able to listen, look at the patient, look at their expressions, try to assess what's going on. And if you have to make a mid-course correction, that's okay. You don't have to be perfectly right all the time. I mean, that was a great lesson for me too. So this is all to say, Johanna, I couldn't admire you more. I mean, you have become not only a very crucial collaborator for the Empathy Project, but you've become a great friend of mine. And I wish you so much luck in the next chapter of your life. And I can't wait to continue to collaborate with you. And I will just end by saying all the best.
Oh, oh my goodness. So wonderful. So wonderful.
Wow.
And so unexpected. Yes, I am surprised. I'm very surprised.
Good. So I want to share a personal story as my way to introduce Dr. Shapiro. Since Dr. Lupuk talked about email, on March 11th, 2013, not in any way a day of note, I happened to be surfing UCI's website to see if there was anyone else remotely interested in what I was interested in, like the relationship between illness and storytelling. A few keywords in, I discovered the Medical Humanities and Arts program at the School of Medicine and founded and directed by a Johanna Shapiro. I sent her an email that afternoon, and later that night she wrote back, and thus began what has become a scholarly comradeship and friendship that is among my most cherished. Under Dr. Shapiro's leadership, the program in Medical Humanities and Arts has provided medical students the time, space, capacity, and skills to show how humanities and the arts can help them develop both critical thinking and empathy to better understand their patients' illness experiences, the doctor, medical team, patient-family relationships, physician self-care, and various other aspects of healthcare. As Dean Stamos shared, Dr. Johanna Shapiro is Professor of Family Medicine here at UCI, and she is the recipient of many teaching awards and honors, including STFM's Humanism in Medicine Award in 2020, UCI's Lauds and Laurels Honor Award for Outstanding Faculty Achievement, and she's also an elected member of the Gold Humanism Honor Society. Her research and scholarship focuses on the process of professional identity formation in medical education, including the impact of training on student empathy, on medical sorry, I lost my document. Hold on. On medical student-patient relationships and on the management of difficult clinical encounters. She was widely published in the field of medical humanities. In addition to all that she has done and continues to do professionally, she also loves spending time with her children and 6 grandchildren, playing folk guitar, walking by the beach, and writing the occasional poem. I will say finally that when I approached her last year to be our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Shapiro characteristically demurred and said that there were others who would be better candidates. With all due respect, I disagreed, and I hope you all support my decision to be adamant that she be the one featured tonight. Her humility matches her brilliance, and you and I will hear and see this tonight. Thank you, Dr. Shapiro, for sharing with us your wisdom.
Oh, my goodness, this is really overwhelming. In fact, I think this would be a very good note to just end the evening on. I feel completely fulfilled, so no worries here at all. I do want to thank Jim and Dean Stamos and Doug Haynes for these very generous introductory remarks. I've had the privilege for working with all of these individuals for, I think it has now been over 8 years. And truly your insight and courage have inspired and educated me. I'd also like to thank Sam Carter and Joanne Jamora, who held my hand and encouraged me with this talk and walked me through the content and the technicalities, and have really helped me all the way. I also wanted to give a moment of thanks to my department, which has always supported my work, my deans, past and present, my amazing husband and family, who always encouraged me, and of course, my students and colleagues, who I think more times than they realized inspired my work. I'd also like to thank everyone here who's taken time to join this session. I hope at the end of this talk that, which I am going to try to keep brief, that we can engage in dialogue together, which is, I think, where most of the richness and learning always emerges. So as you can see tonight, I'm going to be talking about stories of sickness. And I want to start with some stories from my own family of origin. And before I do that, because I keep getting little messages about starting my video, can everyone see my screen? Jim, maybe you could just give me a thumbs up. Perfect.
I can see your screen. I cannot see your video is off, however.
Okay, but I don't have a video.
Oh. Okay.
I mean, are you saying you cannot see my
We see
my
your slide, your title slide.
You cannot see it.
No,
No,
we
we
can
can.
see your title slide.
Okay, excellent. Can you see that slide?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. I think we're off to a good start. So I am having a little trouble with managing my screen here. Let's see if I can. Nope.
Sometimes you have to stop sharing and then share again.
Okay,
Johanna.
there we go. I think this will work. I apologize to everyone. Of course, the technical issues work perfectly in the practice sessions, but we know they never do in real life. So as I said, I'm going to start by sharing some stories of illness from my own family of origin. My mom and dad fell in love playing ping pong at a vacation ranch in the Santa Monica Mountains. But when my father drove from California, where they met, to Illinois, where my mom lived, and asked her father for her hand in marriage, as was the custom, my grandfather fell silent. My father thought it was because he was Jewish, while my mother's people were high church Episcopalians, and he had his arguments marshaled. But although the Episcopalians were not happy about an interfaith union, that was not the main problem. My grandfather, a surgeon, soberly looked at my dad and said, "Nancy won't live more than a year or two." My mom had rheumatic fever as a teen and was left with a weak heart that was supposed to fail her momentarily. My father was unfazed. 4 years earlier, when he himself was only 17, he had lost his beloved father to a massive coronary at the impossibly young age of 38. My father had to drop out of college to support his mother and 3 younger siblings. He had already learned from this tragedy that life was unfair, unpredictable, and sometimes horrifying. But he still believed in love. He stared back at my grandfather and said, "I'm going to marry her anyway." Eventually they eloped, married, and spent 70 years together. This is only one of many, many stories of illness that run through my family in turbulent, vivid streams. There's my own origin family story, how even though my mom did not die, and in fact grew stronger, every reputable physician my parents consulted assured them that her heart could not stand the strain of pregnancy and she would surely die if she had a child. My parents were unsatisfied with this judgment, so they sought the advice of my father's youngest brother, who had just graduated from medical school and was all of 2 weeks into his cardiology residency, so clearly an expert on all matters of the heart. This consultation occurred in the professional setting of the Santa Monica beach, where they were all taking a walk together. My uncle thought, "Can you make it as far as the pier?" he asked my mom, pointing. She proceeded to do so. "Then you can get pregnant," he pronounced, and 10 months later, I was born. These stories swirled through my family as a child. 6 months after I emerged, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a double mastectomy so that, as her surgeon rather bluntly informed her, if you don't die, at least you can bear more children, which she did. I grew up with a mother who had no breasts, and until I was about 4 and happened to glimpse the naked mother of one of my friends, I thought all women must have long, red, horizontal scars across their chests. There was the tragic, life-upending story of my grandfather's death from that massive heart attack, surrounded by the background narrative that his father and his father's father had both died in their early 40s of coronary events. There were the stories of my beautiful, unpredictable, dramatic, and seriously alcoholic grandmother, who was only allowed to hold us children under supervision, who occasionally ran about her neighborhood without her clothes, and whose death at 58 from breast cancer shattered my mother for years. These and many other stories shaped my family and me as a child. We heard them over and over in various permutations. My parents were both novelists, and they knew how to tell a good story. Their narrations were filled with vivid characters, exciting plot twists, moving denouements. These stories made the people in my family who they were. They also shaped our relationships with physicians. But I doubt any of the many physicians who cared for my mom or the rest of our family ever heard these stories. And that's too bad, because if they had, they might have better understood my parents' complex feelings about doctors. On the one hand, my parents were dependent on the physicians who provided the antibiotics that every year pulled my mom through her long bouts of pneumonia, and who gave her the opiates, which helped her cope with the chronic pain of a skull fracture and concussion she'd received in a bizarre accident and the worst pain of her mother's death. Eventually, my mom became addicted, and eventually, without any intervention or help from her doctor, she quit. So on the one hand, my parents were highly dependent on their physicians. On the other hand, they were extremely skeptical and mistrustful of doctors who either told them repeatedly that my mom would die when she stubbornly did not, or who couldn't save the people they loved the most, like their parents, my grandparents. Illness pushes all of us toward disintegration and dissolution. It is our stories that can hold us together and bring us back to our lives. If we're lucky, confronted by illness, we learn to make new stories on our own. But when we are able to share our stories with physicians who know how to receive them and really hear them, we will be more likely to construct better, more satisfying, and more meaningful stories. Academics define illness as a biographical disruption. This simply it means that when your life is going along one way, you have plans, aspirations, dreams, and then suddenly illness intrudes and your life veers off in a completely different and usually worse direction. The story that you knew has become broken. At a young age, both my parents' life stories were unceremoniously broken, and they struggled on their own the best they could to fix them. As their child, I was both fascinated and frightened by all these stories. They were overwhelming, but I had no one to ask how to make sense of them other than the storytellers themselves. If their doctors had heard their stories, they might have been able to build trust with my parents and eventually work with them to craft better, more collaborative stories that saw physicians less as pill dispensers and more as partners in the project of keeping my mom alive and my dad healthy. And I'd like to note here that following the lead of my dear colleague, Dr. Ralph Klayman, for the rest of this talk, whenever possible, I'm going to avoid the term patient because of its many constraining and sometimes demeaning connotations, and simply refer to people and persons, because after all, that is fundamentally what we all are, patients and physicians alike. Now, although everyone is full of stories, including stories of illness, those of us who have shared our stories know it is not always easy to give someone else your story. In my family, stories were always for inside the family, never to be shared outside, and that included our doctors. Sharing your story makes you vulnerable and you fear judgment. Maybe the doctor won't get your story. Maybe they will see it as irrelevant, tangential, or unimportant. Maybe they won't see how precious it is or how dreadful it is. So it can be hard for people to share their stories. But when they do, both research and clinical experience suggest that good things can happen. Now, one of the constants of sociological research on the illness experience is that it is isolating and alienating. People can feel very alone in their suffering. And tragically, we've seen this again and again in the current pandemic. Storytelling, by contrast, reconnects the sick person to others, sometimes to family, friends, or fellow sufferers through a support group or a blog. But also, if they're lucky, it connects them to their physicians, who, after all, are people who've seen the suffering of others over and over and may be expected to understand it better than many lay people. Storytelling also gives people a way of reclaiming their voice, a voice that may have disappeared through the medicalization of their story. People sometimes feel that their story of illness has been taken over and translated into something almost unrecognizable by the medical system. In telling it and sharing it, they can make it their own again. Finally, the connection and agency that arise from storytelling can help people begin to make sense of their lives within the new world that illness has ushered them into, to reclaim or discover meaning, even in these radically altered lives. So people who are sick definitely benefit when they can share their stories. But as many of us also know, it's not always easy to receive someone else's story. This is especially true for stories of illness. Of course, stories of illness can be inspiring and triumphal, but honestly, they're often dispiriting, tragic, horrifying, and filled with suffering. Who wants to hear such stories? Who has time? Doctors often feel that they do not have time. Doctors are very busy, and in today's healthcare system, more so than ever. They always have another entry to make in the electronic medical record, another lab result to review, another person to see. They have very little time to listen to people's stories. But lack of time isn't the whole problem. Stories aren't necessarily novels. Here is an off-cited example of what's known as a 6-word story attributed, although probably erroneously, to Ernest Hemingway. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. If doctors are really listening, people can tell them a story in a single sentence. So it's not only a matter of time. The healthcare system itself is not set up to value people's stories. In institutional structures that emphasize efficiency and productivity, sticking to algorithms and checklists, healthcare by 1,000 clicks, stories can seem like a detour, a distraction. No one gets reimbursed for listening to someone's story. But as the old Hmong adage warns, you can miss a lot by sticking to the point. In the case of clinical medicine, listening only to the information needed to construct a differential diagnosis or assess presenting symptoms can overlook what is most important to the person telling the story. But lack of time, institutional and structural deterrence are still only part of the story. Physicians themselves are often wounded with broken stories of their own, depleted by sometimes insensitive, occasionally merciless training, beset by a multitude of pressures and demands from their institutions on the one hand, and the needs and desires of ill persons on the other. They're the tip of the spear for a broken healthcare system, only with no reinforcements behind them. So they must carry on every day, trying their best as caring, dedicated individuals to remedy problems that often require major societal reforms. We know that at any given time, between 1/3 and 1/2 of physicians and medical students report being burned out, exhausted emotionally and physically, made disillusioned and bitter by problems not of their making. When I query residents why, for example, they didn't ask about someone's story, sometimes they respond ruefully, "I don't want to open Pandora's box." implying they cannot contend with all the demons that will pour out. And no wonder they are fearful. Their emotional and spiritual containers are already filled to overflowing. No wonder they are reluctant to take on anything more, especially things they perceive as burdensome and distressing without easy solution. In truth, doctors often have little idea how to receive such stories. In part, this has to do with how they are trained to listen. Now, medicine trains doctors to listen medically. No surprise there, and that makes perfect sense, to identify signs, symptoms, and information so that they can reach a differential diagnosis. The novelist E.M. Forster used the following short story to illustrate a narrative based exclusively on event and chronology. The king died, and then the queen died. Such a story has some similarities to the basic structure of the HPI, the history of present illness. First, this one symptom emerged, then at some later point in time, another symptom emerged. Unfortunately, this kind of reductive listening makes it difficult to appreciate fully fleshed stories because it ignores plot, character, and emotion. Now, medical listening is, however, well suited to one particular kind of story that narratologists call the restitution story. A restitution story follows a find the problem and fix the problem structure, in which the physician identifies the problem, applies the solution, and the sick person is restored perfectly to their pre-illness life. A person goes skiing, for example. They break their leg, they get it casted, and before you know it, they're back on the slopes. Everyone loves this story, and why wouldn't we? Because the biographical disruption of illness is vanquished, and we get our old lives back, while the physician gets to bask in the glow of fixing our problem, and therefore us. In the restitution story, the person is essentially saying, my body is broken. Can you fix it? When she hears this story, the doctor feels competent, secure, and safe, because this is precisely the story she has been training to hear for at least 7 years, and she is ready to jump in. The physician is center stage in this story, the patient a passive but grateful recipient. But not every story in medicine can be a restitution story. And when this is the case, from the doctor's perspective, receiving these different kinds of stories can seem messy, ambiguous, and onerous. These other kinds of stories need a different kind of listening. There are stories in medicine, as we all know, that are frustrating, confusing, chaotic, terrifying, heartbreaking, of course, for the people and families who experience them, but also, albeit to a lesser extent, for the physicians who must hear them. So how can doctors receive these stories in ways that are compassionate and healing, that support both those who need their care and support themselves, the physicians, as well? In these stories, the person is not saying, my body is broken, can you fix it? But rather, my story is broken. Can you help me make a new one? This question requires a different kind of listening that leads to a different kind of answer. We might call this kind of listening narrative listening. Listening narratively means listening to the HPI, the history of present illness, as if the person is telling a story that is a drama, a comedy, a tragedy, a story that has characters, a plot, a beginning, middle, and sometimes an end. It is listening for the meaning of the story, its essence. Now, returning for a moment to E.M. Forster's classic short story about the death of the king and the queen, he demonstrates plot, character, and emotion by adding 2 words, the king died and then the queen died, of grief. In medical listening, the queen's grief might not matter much in determining her cause of death. In narrative listening, it is the heart of the story. In the words of the medical sociologist Arthur Frank, narrative listening is listening with, not to, the story. Listening to a person's story is an instrumental act driven by the physician's agenda. It's an effort to extract what is deemed significant and discard the rest. Listening with, on the other hand, suggests a mutuality, a kind of collaboration in the process of building relationship. It means being present for a moment with the story. Contextually, the physician engaged in narrative listening works to cultivate an attitude of humility toward the ill person, a willingness to just accompany that person for a few moments, at any rate, in their story, just as a reader might become engrossed in the twists and turns of a character's journey. The physician who listens narratively learns not to block out the suffering of the person, but rather to hold and witness that suffering. In most narratives, even very flawed characters have something likable or relatable about them. Although physicians can find some ill persons challenging, when they are listening narratively, they are able to acknowledge the courage, resilience, persistence, even stubbornness that have enabled the person in front of them to deal with their often very difficult lives. When a physician is listening narratively, she figures out who is important in the story. Who is the protagonist? Is there an antagonist? Who are the supporting characters? What are their dynamics and relationships? The physician who is listening narratively can also identify plot. In other words, the interrelationship between the main events of the story. This includes the climax of the story and its resolution, which is often what the person who is ill is seeking anyway. For example, the plot might be how the person started to feel ill, how this led to a climax of worsening symptoms and going to her family doctor, and the resolution of receiving a diagnosis that helps the person understand what is happening to her. The narrative physician also knows how to tease out the theme, the main idea or point, which in a medical context may be something like, I'm sick and I'm afraid, or I'm here, but I don't want to be. I don't like doctors. When listening narratively, the physician avoids the tendency to instantly try to fix the problem. Rather, she spends a little time understanding the parameters and significance of the story. So, why is narrative listening an important skill in the arsenal of the physician? Scholars and clinicians have suggested that listening narratively can help physicians understand why the person is telling one story and not a different story, why they're emphasizing one symptom and not another symptom. Narrative listening can help doctors empathize more deeply with that person's experience and develop an emotional connection with that person. It can help them appreciate the person, not just the disease. And finally, narrative listening creates the possibility of helping the ill person to construct a better story. Now, this whole idea of helping people construct new narratives might sound presumptuous. It even kind of sounds presumptuous to me. And therefore, it's an idea that always must be approached with a great deal of care and humility. Often it is enough just to listen or to witness another's story. Just by sharing their story, people themselves sometimes begin to edit and revise their story in more congruent and healthy directions. Sometimes a patient with diabetes will tell her story, hear herself telling the story, and if she has space to tell that story, she might conclude, I need to make some changes. Help me figure out how. But according to the ethicist Jody Halpern, the definition of clinical empathy is that while deeply grasping another's story, the physician also may sometimes glimpse elements of a better story. And what do I mean by better? Simply a story that makes more sense for the person given their medical and social circumstances, provides more meaning, gives more hope, appropriate hope. For example, think about this story. Insulin will cause me to go blind. Now, a caring doctor can hear that story, respect its logic, because in fact, the person probably has relatives and friends who started insulin and then suffered a consequence of their disease. So there's a logic to the story, which the doctor can acknowledge. But at the same time, that physician can gently offer a more accurate and hopeful narrative. Or think about this story. Maybe a phase 1 trial will cure my stage 4 metastatic pancreatic cancer. After listening to the person's hopes, fears, and longings, the physician can help them find a story that allows for the possibility of dying while also contemplating how the life remaining to them can best be lived. Narrative co-construction involves a process of shared imagining. In the words of my colleague, emergency medicine physician Megan Osborne, dreaming together. In effect, it is saying to that ill person, given where you are, what can we envision for you in the future? What might this look like? How can we make this happen? In narrative listening, the physician views herself not as the author of the story, a very physician-centric approach, but rather as a collaborator or editor, more person-centered, facilitating the ill person's exploration of their own values and priorities, and helping that person choose a storyline that best supports what lies closest to those core beliefs, principles, and desires. Further, in attempting to help another person create a better story, the physician must also recognize their own story and how it intersects with that of the person seeking care. Do the characters, plot, or theme trigger responses in the physician that might limit optimal co-construction? For example, if the person telling the story tells it in ways that make the physician feel this person doesn't care about their health, then the physician's frustration or judgment, perhaps emerging out of their own personal narratives, may get in the way of assisting the ill person to develop a new story. As I mentioned earlier, like the stories of those asking for their help, there can be pain and suffering in physicians' stories as well. It is perhaps paradoxical that by listening to the stories of others, physicians sometimes can find healing for themselves. When we listen narratively, we discover that we are less burdened by the stories of others, although these stories may still contain distressing, frustrating, even heartbreaking elements. Rather, we are enlivened and inspirited by recognition of our common humanity. We feel better able to bear more because we are bearing it together. As the spiritual teacher Ram Dass once said, we're all just walking each other home. When physicians can glimpse their own very human limitations, their human uncertainties and suffering, as well as their human courage, commitment, and perseverance, when they can glimpse these in the stories of others, they too have the possibility of experiencing a kind of healing. Now, as a brief, but I think important aside, which could be an entire talk in itself, we should ask the question, where does responsibility lie for narrative listening? It's easy to just say physicians should listen narratively more often, but that does an injustice to the good intentions of doctors and the complexities of the systems in which they find themselves working. We're all familiar with the analogy of the canary in the coal mine. When the canary is placed in a toxic environment, it begins to suffocate and die. We can try to save it by giving it antidotes to carbon monoxide poisoning, but we can also try to change the coal mine. Partly, of course, responsibility for narrative listening does lie with physicians themselves. We need to do a better job of training physicians, first by simply giving them permission to listen narratively to show that it is valued, and then by giving them practice in developing the necessary skills. But right now, we make it incredibly difficult for even well-intentioned, open-hearted, and narratively skilled physicians to engage in narrative listening. They are indeed canaries struggling to breathe amidst stifling fumes. So when we look around and see people suffering and physicians suffering, in part as a result of a paucity of narrative listening, we should remember that we can try to save the canaries one bird at a time, but we should also think about changing the coal mine. In this case, this might mean changing the healthcare delivery system to make it more human, less frustrating. For example, changing metrics that prioritize efficiency and productivity over compassionate care, prioritizing people, not paperwork, and changing physicians' workload distribution to prioritize what physicians are uniquely trained to do, that is, diagnose and treat patients rather than argue with insurance companies. It might also mean shifting the culture of medicine to one that recognizes the centrality of stories in health and wellness, as well as populating our healthcare institutions with leaders who view narrative medicine as a professional core competency. In summary, I'd like to say that narrative listening is an essential clinical skill that can benefit both physicians and the person who is seeking their aid. By listening with, rather than only to, the story, physicians learn to relate differently to those who are suffering. Narrative listening provides doctors with a way of being with ill people, even if for just a moment, rather than always simply doing to them. Narrative listening, thus, is a way of sharing suffering, rather than trying to instantly fix suffering. And in the process, it results in coming to understand the other more deeply. This kind of listening honors the truths of those seeking help, and when appropriate, opens the door to helping people rebuild their stories in ways that are better matched to their new realities. Engaging in narrative listening with people who are ill helps them simultaneously adapt to their altered circumstances and also helps them feel more in control of their illnesses and, even more importantly, of their life stories. Narrative listening and story rebuilding also make doctors feel less alone, partnered with, and emotionally connected to those who are sick. And ultimately, it helps them feel more human. When doctors listen with the stories of the sick, they take the first step healing, if not always curing, both suffering others, seeking relief, and sometimes themselves as well. I suspect that with a more generous use of narrative listening, the many doctors who cared for our family could have truly heard my parents' illness stories, and through hearing these stories, might have helped them to co-construct more satisfying, less stressful narratives about our family's many illnesses. In my imagination, I have the idea that such physicians might have helped to sustain and heal my family in ways that mere medicine could not. However, there is no doubt in my mind that my parents, while relishing the creativity afforded through this process of narrative listening and story co-construction, would have insisted on retaining authorial control. And with genuine patient-centered medicine, that is exactly as it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. What a such a rich presentation you've provided. We have about 30 minutes for people to use the Q&A function to ask questions or pose comments, and we already have some comments and a question. So I'm going to go ahead and read it for the sake of our audience. So insightful and brilliant. Do we need to rewrite our story of medical education or training, radically change the way we train our physicians, the way we practice medicine, the way we connect with one another to achieve this quality of care and healing? So that's one question. Yeah. Another question related, can too much empathy be problematic? They say thank you.
Okay, so let's dive in. Those are both wonderful questions, and I'd like to take them one at a time. And, you know, I'd also be so appreciative of hearing from my colleagues, Dr. Lee, Dean Stamos, and Vice Chancellor Haynes, because we all know that one person never has all the answers to these questions. But the first question about radically restructuring medical education, and the question went on in great detail. And so my answer is simple: yes, yes. I think that, you know, I've been at this business in medical education for over 40 years. And I think the good news is that I've seen remarkable progress and evolution. And, you know, not to brag on our own medical school, but I think the changes have not been window dressing. They've been truly significant, and I have great respect for our leadership, who often are pushing against the stream and moving us in directions that are more compassionate and more caring. That said, there are aspects to the structure that I know have been debated for decades and probably will continue to be debated about how to really best structure the education of individuals who, while deeply grounded in research, the majority of the graduates that we turn out are going to be clinicians involved in the care of other human beings. And what do we need to do to make that make the training a little bit more aligned with the outcome that we want? And I'd really be appreciative. We have the dean of our medical school here, so I feel a little embarrassed to be holding forth on this topic, where here's our leader. But Dean Stamos, what?
Well, I'll make a few comments. Thank you, Johanna. I think I agree with you completely, of course. I mean, it's not a simple answer. First of all, I think Johanna's story about her own parents throws, I think, water on the fire in terms of people that say it's a generational problem with the new generation of physicians. I completely dismiss that hypothesis. And I would say, I think the physicians we're training today are every bit as good or better than those that trained when I trained or before I trained that treated Johanna's parents, right? So I think this is not a generational thing at all. It is a structural problem, and I think it's getting worse across the country, hopefully not at UCI, because of, quite frankly, the economics of medicine. You know, when you graduate from medical school, the average debt is now in excess of $200,000. And you've lost between 7 and 12 years of earning capacity because you've been in medical school and residency. There is a lot of pressure, and it's not subtle, to earn back that money and pay down your student debt. Mm-hmm. And that feeds into this whole cycle of I'll say, high salaries, expectation, need for high salaries to cover the cost of paying back your debt and sustaining your lifestyle, etc. It then leads to a necessary productivity that results in a short amount of time with each patient and a emphasis on RVU, what we call relative value unit. That's a work that so it's a measure of productivity. And so everybody wants to be paid fair market value, but there has to be a source of that income to pay if you're in an institution. So it's a vicious cycle. I'm not sure how to break it. I think a single payer system would be a good start, because there is a lot of money that is siphoned out of the medical healthcare system, you know, in the insurance companies and all the industry that at least 30 to 40% of every healthcare dollar is not put back into the healthcare system. So, you know, it's complicated. We have to do our part. Johanna is a big part of what we do at UCI. We're looking to fill her big shoes over the next couple of years. We are confident that she will stay engaged during that process, but I'm happy to discuss it further, but I think that's sort of my 30,000 foot view summary.
Yeah. And, you know, I would just continue the discussion by saying that Dean Stamos' analysis, I think, is very blunt and very accurate. You know, everything comes down to money, but that shouldn't cause us to despair, at least not entirely. You know, I think it is very difficult to shift systems when some people benefit from them more than others. And we just have to look across the board in society to recognize the truth of that. Still, that does not mean that things cannot be changed. And I do believe in the will of the people to exert pressure on leaders. And when things become uncomfortable enough, then people do change. And, you know, single payer system, since Dean Stamos brought that up, has been shown not to be, you know, a perfect solution, but I think is a very important step in addressing some of the issues that we contend with now, you know, downstream. We've got to look upstream as well. And by the way, I did not mean to imply in my talk, every day I see wonderfully talented and skilled physicians doing their best, for example, to engage in, you know, narrative listening. My point is really that the systems in which we find ourselves embedded can make it very difficult. And Vice Chancellor Haynes, did you want to add something?
Well, yes. First, I just want to thank you for that compelling and absorbing presentation. And in answer to the original question, I guess what I'm struck by is that I think we're increasingly coming to appreciate empathy as a human competency that, you know, we can help develop sooner in the educational process. And I think that, and I want to agree with Dean Stamos that in some sense we're really confronting these tensions, because when I listened to what your presentation, I thought narrative listening is a type of inclusive excellence, where you meet people where they are, where you're trying to learn while you're entering into from a type of with humility. And yet we are also inhabiting spaces that are driven by competition, revealing innate characteristics, winner take all, and a sense of cultural arrogance. But I'm still optimistic, in part because what your presentation and your scholarship demonstrates is that there's so much capacity that we have yet to develop when it comes to empathy.
Yes, and I really appreciate your point and agree wholeheartedly that some form of empathy is strongly related to inclusive excellence. I think it's hard to have the one without the other. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to share in response to that question?
You know, I want to give as much space to you and to our audience members as possible. So I will defer because we have 9 other questions in the docket.
Okay.
So I want to make
Okay.
sure that we get to ask and have you hear your wisdom on them. The next question is, are there things that persons can do to help encourage?
Jim, I'm sorry, can we just go back to the empathy question? Because
Sure.
I see that as related but not identical. And I really wanted to address that because, you know, for medical students, this comes up all the time, this question of, can you have too much empathy? And I think that the question, maybe not the question that whoever asked that is thinking, but in general, the question behind that question is there's this idea that if you have too much empathy, it will destroy you. You know, there's now a lot of actually pretty good research showing that patients, using that term, or persons who perceive that their physicians are empathic have much better outcomes. The early research showed better like patient satisfaction, and they like their doctors better and kind of squishy things. But now we have seen that perceptions of empathy are strongly related to clinical outcomes. So that's very exciting. It's good news for the person who is ill. But physicians, rightfully so, worry that if they feel too much for the suffering of the patient, that it will damage them, that, you know, they will end up weeping in a puddle of tears in the floor of the exam room. And I think that that fear, which is a reasonable one, you know, there are actually fMRI studies that show that when people have kind of what they call unregulated empathy, that you start to feel so strongly about the story, for example, that you're hearing, that your focus shifts, right, from that person telling the story to yourself. And you start to make decisions based on managing your own anxiety. And so I would say that that might be an example of too much empathy. But I think that the question stems from kind of a misconstrual of what empathy really is. Empathy is simply both a cognitive and emotional effort to grasp to some small degree, but acknowledging that we can never understand anyone else's story truly. We can never really walk in their shoes. You know, maybe the best we can do is walk beside them. But I think that empathy is a skill, like Vice Chancellor Haynes suggested, that can be trained and developed. And I think the key is in training so that we learn to use empathy as a valuable clinical tool in ways that benefit both the patient first and foremost, but also ourselves. Because what I've come to conclude is that there is a way, which I tried to describe a little bit, probably not very adequately, of being open to other suffering. When you simply sit with the pain of another person, you realize that although it's very difficult, in almost all situations, they will walk through that pain, and so will you as the person caring for them. So I hope that is a little bit of a clarification about empathy.
Okay, we are now at 13 questions. So I'm gonna kind of, you can take however many as you would like, Dr. Shapiro. So the next question is, are there things that patients or persons can do to help encourage narrative listening from their physicians?
That's a great question. I think that, you know, it's not just physicians that are a product of the medical system. Patients too, sick people are also products of the system. And I well remember one time when I had to consult a pulmonologist, and I walked into his office, and I was actually fully clothed, and so was he. So that was cool. But that in itself was kind of a rare experience. We were just sitting down, and he said, "Tell me about yourself." And I responded, great narratologist here, I responded, "Well, don't you have my chart?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I have your chart, but I'd like you to tell me your story." So I think that people who are patients, we're kind of programmed by the system in which we find ourselves. We know that the doctor is going to ask us questions, and we're going to give hopefully very concise answers. But I think that by being a little more assertive, patients can interest their physicians in their stories. Again, I mean, I think that many physicians do want to hear the stories. It's just very hard given the structural limitations. But by saying, you know, there's some things I really think are important for you to know about me. And I think that most doctors will listen, and most doctors will benefit from hearing those things.
Great.
Other comments, or should we just keep rolling along here?
So the next question comes from Chalat Rajaram.
Hi,
Will
Dr.
narrative listening heal physicians suffering burnout and re-energize?
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I would qualify that because first, we don't, the concept of narrative listening is pretty new in itself. There aren't really studies, especially quantitative studies of the whole concept, the concept like maybe empathy, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, is still ill-defined. People use it in different ways. So, I'm speaking more from my own observations of physicians and listening to their stories and the stories of medical students. So I would say my answer is a qualified yes. I think that was one of the points I was trying to make in this talk, that narrative listening is good for patients, but I think it often is good for physicians as well, because it enables them to encounter the suffering and distress of their patients in a witnessing mode, in a storytelling mode, as well as in a find it and fix it. And again, I did not mean to place these two concepts in opposition. I think that they actually work together well. We all like the doctor who can just, prescribe a medication and we feel great. But I think in those situations when that is not possible, this kind of narrative listening can make physicians feel less helpless, because in fact, they are doing something of value for their patient. They're receiving their story.
Have what seems to be a very relevant question of the moment. They begin by saying, beautiful presentation. How would you say how illness narratives have changed with the pandemic? Now, doctors and health workers are experiencing their own illness narratives. Their own narratives are changing while they continue to serve others.
That's a very interesting question. Actually, I will comment that although I have not myself plunged deeply into this literature, I'm very aware that there is a burgeoning of storytelling on the parts of both patients and physicians and other healthcare providers faced with the pandemic. I think on the physician side, based on a very limited number of stories that I've read and heard, I think physicians are experiencing events that most of them in their lifetime have not previously. They've encountered a level of illness and death that they have not seen in this country. And I think that really shapes the narratives they tell. I think that related to that is the feeling of helplessness that physicians feel. I've always suspected that a lot of people go into the study of medicine because they don't like feeling helpless. they like to do something. And in fact, I know a lot of times third-year medical students will say, well, I just can't wait till I'm a little farther along in my training because I feel so helpless. I have nothing to do for patients. And during the pandemic, we are confronting the situation that highly skilled, highly trained, highly experienced physicians, especially at the start, felt they had really nothing that they could offer, or very little that they could offer their patients. I think the effects of these shifts in narrative, we do not yet know. I mean, one possibility is that it will remind physicians of the value of humility in the face of very powerful forces like disease that operate in our world. Dr. Stamos, Dean Stamos, do you have, you've probably heard many, many stories.
Well, I'll just share that I think it's been an evolution over this pandemic over the last 9 months. I mean, so just today I was talking to our chair of emergency medicine, Dr. Chris Fox, and we're having a major surge right now. I don't know if people realize how much it is. It's actually rivaling the summertime surge. And I asked him how he was doing and how his faculty were doing, and he said, we're doing well. We've prepared for this. And the difference now, he said, is that my faculty and my staff are not fearful. They're not afraid of getting COVID from their patients, which they were in March, April, May, and June, because they recognize now that that's not happening with any significant frequency. Most of the healthcare workers who have gotten COVID have gotten it actually either outside of the hospital or in break rooms, exposed to a colleague who is infectious. So I think that's interesting to understand that. I do think they feel helpless, but there is hope on the way. I mean, we now have monoclonal antibodies. We don't have a very good supply, but we have some, and we have a vaccine on the horizon. And so I think that's sustaining people right now. But it is, there was a great picture yesterday on the internet of a physician, not at UCI, consoling a very sick elderly patient. And those are common stories because the patients are not able to be with their loved ones when they're sick or dying. At best, they're able to connect with them on a screen, but when they get really sick, that's not even possible. So I think that's the hardest thing for the caregivers now, is dealing with patients who are alone and dying alone, which is really heartbreaking, of course.
Right. And, I think that there's kind of a bifurcation. I happen to be involved in a study that my department is conducting with family physicians and their responses to the pandemic. And on the one hand, what we've heard is kind of a shock in physicians about the anti-masking movement, about the mistrust and skepticism of science-based information. And it's kind of like, here I am putting my life on the line for you all, and you are running around to, indoor restaurants and hair salons and so forth. So kind of a break in the social trust or the social contract. On the other hand, I think the stories that I've heard often that parallel what Dean Stamos is saying is that it is true that there is immense suffering because of the inability of families to be with their loved ones during grievous illness and then sadly, unfortunately, death. And yet I've seen physicians and nurses, as Dean Stamos described, step up time and again to fill that gap. And while that is immensely stressful, paradoxically, it is also very rewarding. That I've heard many physicians say, I feel more meaning in my job than I have in 20 years. So I think there are these very different, very intense stories that are emerging, and how they affect the profession and how they affect us as a society remains to be seen.
Well, that's a nice segue to a question from actually my former colleague, Phil Barish at UT Austin. He writes and asks, Dr. Shapiro, and I'm going to provide a friendly amendment and ask Dean Stamos perhaps to also respond to this question. Do you believe that narrative listening and related skills and approaches can and should be taught throughout the medical curriculum, or should they be focused on in dedicated classes, or maybe both?
Well, I know what I think, but Dean Stamos, maybe I give you a crack at that first.
Well, I mean, I think you listen, in order to teach it, you have to have teachers, don't you? So I think, you know, we can't necessarily say that every one of our teachers is skilled in teaching this. So I think the answer is both, right? Because we have to do it right now in focus classes with experts like Dr. Shapiro and other experts that we have already on campus. And then we need to train the trainers, right? We do that in other areas. So we need to learn to train the trainers so that all of our faculty are skilled at not just teaching this, but actually, you know, the best teacher is to do it by example, right? And so when the third and fourth year students see the faculty behaving that way in the clinical environment, that's the best way to reinforce that learning. It's not in a classroom. I hate to say it. Of course, you have to have the classroom too, but it's the reinforcement, and they see how that affects patients. They say, "Oh, wow," you know. And I've had that in my own career. I've had a few students who have commented about how they used to see me sit down always at the patient's level and hold their hand while I'm talking to them, almost routinely. That was what I did as part of my practice, because I think it's a way to connect with the patients, just narrative medicine. So I think it's learning by example. We need to train the trainers.
Yes, and I agree with that. You know, I think being a non-physician myself and having spent my entire career working with physicians, I think that medicine can benefit from the outside perspective. Having people who are not doctors look at what they do and say, did you ever think about this or that? However, I agree completely with Dean Stamos that where most learning in medical training occurs is at the bedside through the role modeling of physicians and residents and attendings. I think looking at our own medical school here, there are many, many, many physicians who have never heard of medical humanities, who have never heard of narrative listening, and practice it every day. What I think is probably less evident is that there isn't a lot of explicit attention on why these physicians are so effective with their patients, what makes them so empathic. So, for example, after rounds, the team might talk about the lab results or the results of a procedure and how medications are going to be adjusted and when discharge planning should begin. But there's less attention to, so what did you notice about the way I interacted with the patient? What did you notice about how his wife responded? Was there anything that you might have done differently? That kind of conversation doesn't need to be a novel, getting back to that idea, but to spend a few minutes focusing on the process of these interactions, which after all, this is the heart of clinical medicine, what happens between the person who is ill and their doctor. I think if we had more of that and we trained our physician colleagues how to do that a little more directly, we would see immense benefit.
And Johanna, you should comment on the effect that will have on compliance of the patients.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the research findings that physicians who are perceived as more empathic have more adherent patients who are adherent to medical regimen. And that's for the obvious reason that those people trust their doctors more because their doctors have listened to him. I mean, hate to say it, I wish this were rocket science. Maybe I would win a Nobel Prize, but this is pretty commonsensical. It's not that complicated.
So we have an embarrassment of rich questions, so I'm making the hard decision to ask this final one. How might we invite others beyond the community of medical professionals, such as advocates, patients, and allies, into co-creating constructive and transformative health narratives? Do you have any advice for folks who are not doctors in regards to how they can support this process?
Right. Well, that is a wonderful question. And I think it dovetails really well with what I was saying, that I don't mean this in a critical sense, but I think that medicine tends toward being a somewhat closed experience. And in my observation, that starts very early on in medical training. Once students go through anatomy, which happens in their first year, they begin to feel that they have separated from other ordinary people because they've gone through this very intense, sometimes traumatic, always revealing experience. And I think that as time goes on, some physicians feel more and more that the only people who can really understand them are other doctors. And so it can be hard to open up the system to input from others. And then there is, the whole hierarchical nature of medicine, which is still much more a vertical profession than a horizontal profession, although that too definitely is changing. For example, the empowering of nurses and nurse practitioners, which is another conversation. But I certainly would advocate for creating opportunities where physicians can listen narratively to others, to patients' families, to advocates. If anyone has seen like a really good family conference, which is something that happens in our hospital and happens all over the country, when they're run well, they're really an opportunity for the physicians who are directing the care of the loved one to listen to the needs of the family. And I think that's a good model, but I think it could be expanded because the questioner is so right. There's so many people involved in the care of an ill person. And very often those voices are marginalized. And going back to Vice Chancellor Haynes' comment about inclusive excellence, that I think medicine could be made a more excellent profession by incorporating those voices, again, with listening and with humility.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. There are many more questions, and I've promised each of the questioners that we will share these questions with you after the formal end of this presentation. There are other comments as well. We are at the conclusion of our event. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Dr. Shapiro for this amazing presentation. I think our executive committee was wise to insist that you be our speaker this time around. Thank you, Dean Stamos and Vice Chancellor Haynes, for your lovely remarks and your presence here. And thank you everyone for coming to this distinguished lecture. You'll be receiving a follow-up email inviting feedback, and that will also send you to the link of recording. So if you know people who couldn't attend this event, this would be their opportunity to view the event recorded. So once again,
Yes,
thank you.
I did just want to say too, thank you so much everyone who stuck this out, and the questions were wonderful, so thought-provoking. And yeah, I would be very happy to, if there's a way to do so, and I know who the question is from, I'd be very happy to send you an email answer or pursue this, because that's really what it's all about, is the dialogue.
In our feedback email, we will put in a link or a place where people can pose their question to you, and we'll send those along to you, Dr. Shapiro. Thank you.
Right.
Everyone, be well, stay safe, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and be kind to everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. What an honor. Thank you.
There you have it.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I am so sorry about the